Welcome to the show. A few days ago, I noticed that my son was working on a knife design, and I looked at it and I thought, this actually looks really, really cool. He's 8 years old, but he's a really smart and creative kid. And as I was looking at it, I thought, I could probably actually make this for him. So I asked him what he thought of that idea, and of course he loved the idea. And so we kind of refined the design a little bit, although this right here is very, very close to what he had already made. And he had even made up like a little mock-up for it out of cardboard and paper and tape. So after working out a few kind of little details and making sure that I had the idea that he was going for, I transferred the design to a piece of wood. Then I had him help me cut it out on the scroll saw. This is kind of a bad camera angle, but trust me, in real life his face was not that close to the scroll saw. So once that was done, I roughed out the rest of the shape on the belt grinder and let him feel it in his hand and see what he thought of it. And once I had his approval, I went ahead and made the knife. So I started with the lawnmower blade that I used on my last project. I'll put a link to that here so you can watch that video if you want. So I actually made a photocopy of the wood model that I had made, and then cut it out, refined it a little bit, and then transferred that design to the metal. Cutting this out was a little bit trickier for me this time than on some of the other projects I've done. I think probably the biggest thing was that because the knife was smaller, a lot of the angles are smaller and a lot of the little areas that you need to get into. So it was a little bit trickier than some of the other ones, but I also have a little more experience with it now. So all in all, it went pretty well. Then I cleaned that up on the belt grinder. And let him feel that in his hand, and he gave me a little bit of feedback. He wanted that finger choil to be recessed a little further into the grip. And overall, he wanted the design to stay small. I think he really liked the idea of having a very small knife. Now, I'll be honest here, I really thought the bevel was going to give me a lot of trouble. I've only really put bevels on a few knives. And a lot of those, especially the ones I was doing a few months ago, I was basically blacksmithing those and doing a lot of work on the bevel with the forge and the hammer. So I'm very much inexperienced when it comes to the stock removal method. But with that said, it did seem like things worked out pretty well. I screwed up the bevel in a couple of spots. I kind of thought, oh no, this is going to get away from me, but it actually came back pretty well. I think the key here is to take your time. If you start to get worried and you start to think, oh, I'm screwing things up, step back, take a look at it, see what you need to fix, and then come back to the grinder and be deliberate about what you're going to do. Don't just kind of sit there and monkey around. I definitely did my share of that, but I found that really, finding that bevel that you want, feeling it, pressing into it, and drawing the blade across in one smooth motion is, at least for me, that's the way that definitely works best. Of course, keeping the blade cool is a little bit challenging when you have a very small blade like this. So I tried to go a little at a time and kept dipping it in water to keep it cool between passes over the belt. So once I had a satisfactory bevel, I brought it down to about a 1/16 of an inch, and then decided to go for the heat treat. I could have fired up the forge for this, but it just takes a lot of time and it's messy because I'm still using charcoal and stuff. So I figured with a blade that small, I could use my propane torches. And I have to say, it did work, but it was very challenging to get it to heat evenly. And I would heat up one part of the blade and then it would cool down while I was heating another part of the blade, and so I kind of had to reposition things. I just kept checking it with the magnet and trying to get a sense of when the color I'm seeing corresponds to that ideal heat where it's non-magnetic. I was a little bit surprised because there wasn't a lot of smoke or steam, but I did check it with the file and it was certainly hardened. So then we brought it into the house and tempered at, I think, 450 for about an hour, for a little over an hour. And then once I had it tempered, I brought it back out to the belt grinder and cleaned it up. And here I used an old worn 120 grit belt. So I really didn't want to, wind up messing up the bevel or putting any deep scratches in the metal. So after cleaning it up, I carefully put a little bit of a secondary bevel on there to give me my edge. I put a pretty decent edge on it. I wasn't going for razor sharpness, but I think it has a pretty good edge. Then for the scales, I used a scrap of oak, and I just traced the outline of the handle part of the knife onto the wood. And then cut that in half the long way down the middle. And then check back with the original design to get a good sense of how the scale should be shaped where they meet the ricasso part of the knife. And once I had the other side matched up, brought them both over to the belt sander and just cleaned up again that area where that area at the top of the scale where it's going to meet the ricasso, because that area there is, of course, really hard to shape once you have the scales glued to the knife. And then I went through my usual process of putting scales on. I clamp the knife in place, drill a couple of holes for the pins, then line up the scale where I want it, drill one hole, put the pin material in place to hold it there, drill the other hole, and then use the one scale as a template to do the other one. So once I had all the holes drilled, I pinned everything in place to make sure everything worked, and then took it over to do the epoxy. This time I used a clear epoxy that I believe is made by DevCon. It was fairly inexpensive, so this is also kind of a test to see whether it's good stuff. Now this is a fast-setting epoxy. It only takes about 5 minutes to set up. So I had to work quickly. Unfortunately, I did not use gloves when I was doing this, which you should always do. And of course I got some on my hands, so then as soon as I had things clamped in place, I ran to the house and did my best to clean the epoxy off my fingers. I think I got most of it. Now the instructions claimed that this stuff was workable within 1 hour. So this is really, really fast setting, fast drying epoxy. I gave it about 2 hours anyway, and then I came back, removed the clamps, and took the pins down flush with the cutoff wheel and the grinder. Then of course it's back to the belt grinder. And it's a very small knife, so I tried a few different things for holding it. To begin with, of course, there's enough thickness in the scales that I could use my hands, but after a while that became problematic, so I found a kind of a spring-loaded clamp that had a really strong spring on it, so it gripped the knife pretty well. So I used that to kind of keep my fingers out of harm's way while I did this. Then for the finer work, it was back to the Dremel. That was especially helpful for getting into that finger choil area and for doing some of the finer sculpting on the scales. And of course I finished it all up by hand with some sandpaper. I think this is 220 grit that I was using here. So there's the finished knife. My son absolutely loves it, and I had a lot of fun with the project. I learned that while some things are easier on a smaller knife, there are also some things that are a lot more difficult. Honestly, grinding the bevel was probably, when I went into the project, that was what I was expecting to have the most difficulty with. But coming out of it, I can say that actually went really well. Areas that I found more challenging had to do with just doing that little detail work, kind of getting into those small areas. And really the glue up phase too, that was That was a little challenging, just finding, it wasn't hard to get the scales on there, but finding a way to kind of fit all the clamps into place where they'd really, grip that knife well, but where the pins weren't running into the clamps and holding them out of the way. But overall, it was a lot of fun, and I'm really glad that I've started focusing more on making knives because I have learned a ton over the last several weeks. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. If you have anything you'd like to say, leave a comment below. I'm pretty new to this craft, so I am totally open to any advice that you want to give or any questions you want to ask. And if you like this video and you're new to the channel, check out some of my other videos. I've done a little bit of blacksmithing and some knife making and a few different things, so you'll probably find something else you'd like too. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.